This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Thaddeus Stevens was a giant among men.
Stevens was a champion for individual rights, and and that's why some people hated him.
So I think he felt everyone should be equal. Everyone should have the opportunities, the same opportunities to grow and to progress and to be who they felt they could be.
Here you have a major figure in mid-19th century politics. Arguably one of the most effective legislators and politicians in American history, and not too many people know about him.
He is the greatest unknown person in American history.
With all the accomplishments associated with Thaddeus Stevens, you have to wonder why he's so overlooked in American history. We hope to share with you the insights and perspectives of some of the foremost authorities about Thaddeus Stevens to find out more about this man. The unveiling of a new life-size statue of Thaddeus Stevens in front of the Adams County Courthouse here in Gettysburg solidifies the valuable legacy of Thaddeus Stevens. The impetus for that statue comes from a group of historians and scholars committed to preserving the life and legacy and his place in American history.
I'm Ross Hetrick, president of the Thaddeus Stevens Society, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the legacy of Thaddeus Stevens, the most powerful congressman during and after the Civil War.
Thaddeus Stevens grew up in Vermont, but moved to Pennsylvania following his education. He taught briefly in York and became a successful lawyer in Gettysburg, where he served several terms in the Pennsylvania state legislature. He later moved to Lancaster and represented that city in the U.S. Congress. While serving in Washington, he became one of the most forceful and influential opponents of slavery, espousing a dogged commitment to the concept of equality for all people, regardless of race or economic standing.
He ushered through the 14th Amendment, which is one of the most significant amendments to the Constitution. He also was instrumental in the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, which is actually shown in the movie Lincoln, where all men are created equal. It is a goal that we have had for hundreds of years in this country, and Thaddeus Stevens, I would say, was the great apostle of equality.
A nationwide search for a sculptor for the project led the Thaddeus Stevens Society to Chattanooga, Tennessee. World-renowned artist Alex Paul Loza, a native of Peru, became enamored by the life of the man whose image he was commissioned to create.
Well, something that I like to do before I create a piece is really immerse myself in who the person is. And the more I found, the more I wanted to know more about him. And something that came across throughout all the research was that he was a type of person that he was always moving forward. It didn't matter what was across or what was standing in front of him. He'll find a way how to go over or just move forward, right? And that's what I wanted to capture with this sculpture.
This statue is really unique because it's really in motion, and he is clutching perhaps his greatest achievement, which is the 14th Amendment, which is the most significant amendment to the Constitution that requires equal treatment under the law and also extends civil liberties to the state level. So it should be like a little history lesson in itself.
Stevens spent about a third of his life here in Gettysburg, becoming heavily involved in the community, professionally, politically, and economically, and demonstrated his prowess as an attorney.
Thaddeus Stevens was an incredibly good attorney. During his time in Adams County, from 1816 to 1842, he was the attorney of record in more than 3,000 civil cases. The success of Thaddeus Stevens as an attorney was the bedrock of his financial success, from which he could leapfrog into politics and into real estate.
But one case he took on early in his career, in which he argued successfully on behalf of a slave owner, led to his feeling remorse for winning that case, in which a mother, Charity Butler, was returned to slavery in Maryland and separated from her husband and 2 young children. After that, it's believed Stevens pledged to never again allow his courtroom ability to contradict his core beliefs against slavery.
He must have had incredible guilt because this was something that he was involved with. After the Charity Butler case, Thaddeus Stevens never again defended a slave owner against a slave or brought suit on behalf of a slave owner against a slave. Never again. And for the next 47 years, he embarked on a crusade for equality, a crusade to end slavery, first at the local level, then at the state level, and eventually at the federal level. And eventually, he won.
Stevens' success as an attorney helped to finance numerous property acquisitions in Gettysburg, including a farmhouse which became Robert E. Lee's headquarters during the Battle of Gettysburg. On land provided by Stevens, Gettysburg College was established, and he served on the trustee board for 34 years. Some of his properties became commercial or industrial establishments that provided employment. The best example is the Caledonia Iron Works, today part of a popular state park, which employed several hundred people and had the largest black workforce of any employers at the time.
When Caledonia was burnt to the ground by the Confederates on the way to the Battle of Gettysburg, Thaddeus Stevens' first concern was with the people who lived here, and he continued to pay them even though he wasn't getting any income from it until he was able to rebuild the furnace. He was here right before they came, and he went off to Shippensburg to escape. But he commented, and he said, I understand that they were very disappointed that he understood that the chivalry was very disappointed that I wasn't here. And then when he heard about the burning, he said, did they burn the debts also?
The ownership of multiple properties, both here in Gettysburg and later on in Lancaster, coupled with his ferocious opposition to slavery, fueled speculation that some of the places he owned were likely stops on the Underground Railroad.
There was a Underground Railroad trail in the west of Adams County along the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and Stevens owned many properties along that Underground Railroad, and it's alleged that he told the people who had a mortgage with him or who were renting from him that this is what they do, and they would keep quiet.
The Underground Railroad was clandestine, but it was also fairly well known, in some, not necessarily here, but we know from a man who
some
escaped
records.
was told to come to Lancaster, come down from the train station, which was at that time 2 blocks away, and that they would find assistance at the office of Thaddeus Stevens.
Several years ago, while renovating Thaddeus Stevens' former office in Lancaster, archaeologists discovered an underground cistern between a tavern and Thaddeus Stevens' office that looked suspiciously like a hiding place for runaway slaves.
We found a cistern, which again wasn't necessarily unusual. We were expecting to find things like this when we excavated in the courtyard behind Thaddeus Stevens' house. But this particular cistern had been modified, and we could date the modifications pretty cleanly to the middle of the 19th century, probably the mid-1850s. Someone built a passageway through the cistern, or into the cistern as the case might be, and that passageway led through a gap between 2 foundations in what we call now the Clyde's Tavern building, so that a person could climb with relative ease between the basement of the tavern into this abandoned cistern. And we, again, date this to a period where we believe that Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith were living in Lancaster. This was in a time when he was no longer serving in Congress. At that time, he was practicing law and living in Lancaster. And our conclusion was that they had made these modifications specifically to hide something in the cistern. And we have concluded that it was likely used as an escape room, if you will, or a safe house for African American people escaping from slavery in the South up through the North.
Uncovering the past of such prominent people was absolutely, an archaeological dream. We attracted so much interest. The community was so interested in what we were doing, and the appetite for both archaeology and the material legacy of Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith was so powerful.
Lydia Hamilton Smith was a confidant of Stevens, who helped to keep his financial records and managed some of his properties.
Initially, his housekeeper turned out to be his business partner, and she helped him with his business. She was there. She accompanied him on his trips to Washington, D.C. She was there in the home. She ran the home. And again, he assisted her in purchasing properties, and she owned a boarding home in Washington, D.C., which was almost unheard of for not just a woman, but particularly a woman of color.
She played a critical role in managing Stevens' schedule, his household, but also kept him alive in the closing years of his life. We might not have had the 13th and 14th Amendments if Lydia Hamilton Smith had not been caring for a man whose body was literally falling apart. And here she is picking up the pieces and keeping him able to get to Washington to do the work that needed to be done.
In a victory for historic preservation, the building that housed Stevens' office was preserved and saved from demolition in the early 2000s, based on the archaeological discoveries and the records of O.C. Gilbert, whose first-hand account of Stevens' assistance was the proof needed for historic preservation.
Now that we have this property as being designated as an authentic safe house of the Underground Railroad based on one episode of a formerly enslaved man, his brother, and associates coming here in the late 1840s, and his testimony, this formerly enslaved man, O.C. Gilbert, knocking on this door and being invited in and given food and directions to the next safe house of the Underground Railroad, which is 6 miles to the east of here, is enough that the National Park Service designated this site as what's called a site in the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom.
That and the advocacy of several prominent community leaders and 2 community newspapers opened the door for creation of a museum to honor the legacy of both Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith. It will be created by Lancaster History, a prominent preservation society.
That makes this a remarkable national story at a time, I think, when the nation needs to excavate from its history where are the examples of people who were highly principled, who fought with integrity and determination, and sometimes with terrible sarcastic wit. Anyone who knows Stevens knows he was a powerful orator, but also could cut you down, but usually for good political purposes, as I'm sure he would say.
Stevens didn't have the advantage of the electronic age, of recording and broadcasting his every word into homes on TV and social media. But those who heard him speak say he was a master at communication.
People who heard Thaddeus Stevens in the State House of Pennsylvania and in Congress said he was spellbinding. Spellbinding. His oratory was incredible.
Stevens' legacy is in stark contrast to the other native son of Lancaster and contemporary of Stevens, James Buchanan, the 15th President of the U.S. and a formidable political rival.
In this community, to realize you have these 2 powerful politicians, both attorneys, both practicing in the same town, but more politically opposite than you could imagine. And we've got an opportunity how many communities are there in the nation that have 2 pivotal leaders living in that same community and acting on the national stage at the same time? I can't think of many. And especially that tell such a remarkably different set of stories about the same issues that led to the Civil War and post-Civil War.
A defining moment of Stevens' legal career was when a slave owner came to Christiana, Lancaster County to apprehend his runaway slave. Local people resisted and ended up killing him. Stevens took the lead in defending them against treason charges.
They gathered up most African Americans in the community. They arrested formally 35, as well as 4 Quaker gentlemen. and took them to prison in Moyamensing to hold them for treason, which was they used because they stood against a federal law. And that's when Thaddeus came here. He actually spent 3 days here in this hotel interviewing people to get the full gist of the story, and he did very well. He used the opposing side, their own views on the African Americans. They said, oh, how can they possibly be so intelligent to come up with such a plan to resist against these slave owners? And when it was all said and done, it went to the jury, and in 15 minutes they came back with a not guilty verdict.
Thaddeus Stevens' commitment to equality led him to become a champion for access to education. One of his legacy achievements is helping Pennsylvania stay committed to free public education. The 1790 Constitution mandated free public education in Pennsylvania, but an 1809 law only offered it for free if you classified yourself as a pauper. That was changed in 1834 to give free access to school for all children. The problem was people soon realized it was costing them a lot more in taxes. State legislators then proposed a bill to repeal that free access provision.
The Senate passed that repeal, but when it got to the House in the Congress of 1835, a lot of people were opposed to it. They didn't want to repeal it. And it culminated in a speech by Thaddeus Stevens, which many regard as maybe his greatest speech, but certainly one of his greatest speeches, where he tried to show that it was actually less expensive to pass this bill than go back to the 1809 bill, plus indicated that it was much better for society to have an educated population and that we should repeal the act and go back to the Free Public Education Act that had just been passed. He got a standing ovation, the local newspapers, and people felt that his speech was so eloquent that it was the difference, and that's why he's deemed the savior of public education in Pennsylvania. He advocated for the poor, the downtrodden, the oppressed, those that were discriminated against, and I think it all goes back to his childhood. Thaddeus Stevens was born in 1792. When he was born, he had a club foot.
That physical disability, his club foot, is often referenced when trying to explain why he had such a passion to advocate for those at the bottom of the social ladder.
Because of his disabilities, he was concerned about others who had less visible disabilities, African Americans, for example, and he believed everyone should have equal access under the law. And of course, that wasn't the case during his lifetime, because of slavery and other forms of discrimination. So I think he projected some of the deficiencies in his own life and said, I'm going to help offset those in other people's lives.
He realized that you can't judge a person by what you see. You have to get to know a person and understand a person.
Stevens went on to Dartmouth College, where he was the poorest student there, who was discriminated against. Even though academically he qualified for induction into the honorary, he was not admitted. He didn't have money for books or anything. He attributed education as the great equalizer and the reason that he was able to overcome the circumstances of his lives and become successful, and he wanted that for everyone else. So I think that's the reason that he not only supported the Public Education Act, but he was a founding member and certainly a driver in the establishment of Gettysburg College and certainly Thaddeus Stevens College and many other education initiatives.
His assistance to create what has become Thaddeus Stevens College is another of his greatest legacies. It's now a successful trade school in Lancaster, begun with a gift from Stevens' will, designed specifically for indigent orphans to teach them a trade.
You know, he endowed $50,000 at that time to create a space where students can learn to learn a trade, to a livable pathway, but most importantly, regardless of race, regardless of religion, he wanted them to be able to sit at the same table and eat together and be created equal. And that's the legacy we continue here on the college. Well, his life was very specific, wasn't it? I mean, being an abolitionist, fighting for equal education and educational opportunities for free of students, to build up, trades and opportunities. He was a very, specific advocate and a champion for the less fortunate.
There was another specific directive that Thaddeus Stevens issued while he was still alive, and that had to do with where he was to be buried.
Thaddeus Stevens selected this spot because this is a location back in his day where people of different races could be buried.
That was the only cemetery that would allow blacks and whites to be buried together in the same cemetery.
He wanted to leave a lasting legacy of the message of treating people equally and equitably. So this is a final resting place for him for that reason. And he wanted to make sure that that point was made even when he was laid to rest.
His funeral was attended by thousands of people, a large percentage of whom were black.
U.S. colored troops escorted him from Washington, where he died, to his gravesite in Lancaster, and he was honored every year thereafter. They had many, many events honoring him and what he did and what he stood for.
For years after his death, the only group that really honored his memory were African Americans. They would make pilgrimage to his grave in Shriner Cemetery, and they'd hold speeches about the great commoner and what he had done for democracy in this country.
But in his day, Thaddeus Stevens received mixed reviews. As endeared as he was to champions of equality, he was hated by those who were determined to preserve slavery. His parliamentary maneuvers in Congress almost single-handedly kept the Southern Democrats from reestablishing laws that essentially institutionalized slavery, even after the Emancipation Proclamation. He succeeded in arranging for a close friend named Edward McPherson to be the House Clerk, whose job it was to call the roll at the beginning of each session, a session in which Southern Democrats were intending to reverse the outcome of the Civil War.
What happened was after Lincoln was assassinated, the new president was Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat. And he allowed the Southerners to hold elections. And they elected Confederate officials and military officers to Congress. And they planned to join up with their Northern Democratic allies, and basically they were going to reinstate slavery. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, but there was a loophole because it said that involuntary servitude is illegal except if you're a convict in prison. So they just made all black people convicts. They said if you step off your plantation and you don't have a job, which of course they wouldn't, you're a vagrant and can be put back onto your plantation as a convict. Involuntary servitude.
Edward McPherson called the roll, but excluded the names of the Southern Democrats. That prevented them from voting.
If the Southerners had taken their seats, there would never have been any Reconstruction, and there never would have been a 14th Amendment.
Because of his legislative genius, Thaddeus Stevens is credited with saving African Americans from a return to legal slavery, which has been termed the Second American Revolution.
His idea was to basically, and I think this stems from his early career as a teacher, he wanted to teach them a lesson. He wanted to take away the land from the aristocrats and to redistribute it to the freed blacks and the poor whites, so that they had a more of a yeoman farmer type system rather than the aristocracy that prevailed in the South. He wanted, despite his harsh language, he just wanted to make the South a equal society, and teach them a lesson.
The groundbreaking movie Birth of a Nation in 1915 portrayed him as an evil, spiteful, corrupt politician and villain.
He was a victim of what is known as the lost cause mythology, which was perhaps the most successful propaganda campaign in human history, where the losers of the Civil War, who were fighting to destroy the country and retain slavery, have somehow turned this around to be a noble cause. And they also had to have a fall guy, and the fall guy was Thaddeus Stevens, and he was the villain in two movies that promoted the lost cause mentality. And in one of those movies, the heroes were the Ku Klux Klan.
Also, he was not necessarily a pleasant person if you were his enemy. He had an acerbic wit, and people don't like smart Alex.
Stevens also falls victim to a tendency to focus our attention in American history on presidents, not members of Congress. even though Thaddeus Stevens' influence was just as important, if not more so, in shaping American society.
Thaddeus Stevens is one of the underappreciated heroes of 19th century America. He took what we had as a wonderful document, the Declaration of Independence, and he helped operationalize it. Not everybody believed quite literally that all men are created equal. Thaddeus Stevens believed that. And Thaddeus Stevens spent much of his political career and his political capital and his energies trying to make America live up to its own Declaration of Independence, its own promise of equality for all Americans. Thaddeus Stevens made a difference. He was a biting speaker, but he was a pragmatic politician. He was a person who was in the vanguard for racial justice in this country. He pushed people like Abraham Lincoln hard to move further, to move faster, to realize the promise of the Declaration of Independence. And as a result, we have a better country.
One intentional characteristic of the sculpture that illustrates Thaddeus Stevens is the way his coat appears to be flowing in the breeze, as if Thaddeus is moving forward, against the prevailing winds of thought of his day, all the while clutching a copy of his signature achievement, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, that guarantees equal rights to all Americans. The man who designed the sculpture says that was intentional.
I think he was also a person that was like ahead of his time, like he was thinking ahead of how this amendment can benefit others in the future. So I decided to put him like grabbing that so tight and really close to him because he was gonna do everything possible to make this happen.
When Winston Churchill passed, Leo Strauss spoke of a profound obligation to remind ourselves and our students of political greatness, of human greatness, and the peaks of human greatness. More than 150 years after the passing of Thaddeus Stevens, we're still reminding ourselves and our students of his unsurpassed greatness.
One of the basic conflicts in American history has been over property rights and individual rights. What the South fought for was property rights. They believed that they could own people. And Stevens was a champion for individual rights.
It's important that we honor the legacy of Thaddeus Stevens because it is an important legacy of the United States, that while we had the sin of slavery at the beginning of our country, we also had people fighting it from the beginning of our country, like Thaddeus Stevens and the slaves themselves. And this was a coalition that eventually succeeded in bringing about a more equal society. And so I think people should take inspiration from that and continue to maintain and pursue an equal society in the United States.